So this morning, I want to talk about answering the uncertain call of God. So we're going to do some throwback here. Yeah, we're going to go a blast from the past. And anyone, probably under the age of 20 for sure, is not going to know what this first part is about. So do you remember the days of the rotary phone? Yes. Yes, we're gonna age ourselves, and everyone who remembers is gonna just put up their hand. And for the young folks, the rotary phone doesn't turn around in the spot. Okay. So when I was a kid, my grandma had a rotary phone, and I remember making phone calls on that thing. And yes, there was a sense of great success when you could dial a long distance phone number on one try. And how many times you would miss the spot, and you'd have to hang up again and pick it up and try for round two, and you get to round 4 or 5 and be like, you know what, we need to get just the numbers here. We need a push button phone. Even local numbers sometimes were difficult. I mean, I remember the days when it was just 7 numbers, and you get to the 6th one, and that's not the right number. Try again. The kids today do not know the hardship it was just to call a friend. There should be an amen to that. And now, the phones, just some of them, you just show your face to it and they unlock, and that's pretty crazy. My phone does not do that, or I haven't set it up. Anyway, what about call display? Anyone remember call display? Well, you still have call display, but remember the days when we didn't have call display, and someone would call, and who's that? And yeah, you didn't know, is this friend or foe that is calling me? And you hesitate. I'm not expecting any calls. And you just had to go in cold. There's no way of knowing. And you didn't even have a chance to prepare a witty comeback for the telemarketer. So the biggest one that I've been getting lately is duct cleaning. And I either tell them I don't have any ducts and they're really confused, or I tell them I don't have ducks but I have chickens, which I don't even have chickens anymore. And then they're really confused. Anyway, don't do what I do. Just don't mess with the telemarketers. But anyway, you just had no chance to avoid it. So in the same way that we face uncertainty, dialing the rotary phone, if you still have it, or answering the phone with no call display, sometimes we face uncertainty when God comes calling as well. There are times when we feel God calling us to do a certain thing or go to a certain place, and we just feel unprepared. These moments can bring fear and intimidation and uncertainty, insecurity, anxiety, any numbers of concerns and self-doubts that can stop us from doing what God has called us to do. That's true, right? When God comes calling, we sometimes want to go running. So this morning we're going to look at a story of God's calling. And this is the story of a poor widow from Zarephath and her encounter with a prophet named Elijah. So here's where our story begins. We meet the widow in 1 Kings 17, verse 8. Then Elijah said to the Lord, or then the Lord said to Elijah, "Go and live in the village of Zarephath near the city of Sidon. I have instructed a widow there to feed you." So he went to Zarephath. As he arrived at the gates of the village, he saw a widow gathering sticks. And he asked her, "Would you please bring me a little cup of water?" As she was going to get it, he called to her, "Bring me a bite of bread, too." But she said, "I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house. And I have only a handful of flour left in the jar and a little cooking oil in the bottom of the jug. I was just gathering a few sticks to cook this last meal, and then my son and I will die." But Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go ahead and do just what you have said, but make a little bread for me first. Then use what's left to prepare a meal for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There will always be flour and olive oil left in your containers until the time when the Lord sends rain and the crops grow again." So she did as Elijah said, and she and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days. There was always enough flour and olive oil left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. So before we go on, I just want to consider where Elijah has come from, because we first meet Elijah in the first part of chapter 17. And when we meet Elijah, he's gone to King Ahab, the king of Israel, and he said, "There will be no rain until I say so." There will be no rain. And I feel like of all the prophetic things to do, this has to be the most gutsy, or one of the most gutsy. I mean, can you imagine going up to a government leader, a municipal leader, whatever it is, a political leader, and saying, "This nation has fallen from God. There will be no rain until I say so." I don't know. I don't know if I would do that. I'd be really nervous. But he did it, and it took a lot of guts. So after Elijah went to King Ahab, the Lord commanded him to go into hiding. So he went into hiding. So he went and hid by a brook, and he was fed by ravens, and they brought him food every day. And eventually the brook dried up, so he had no more water, and then he was on the move again. And this is our first meeting of Elijah, the guy who was fed by ravens, who told the king no. But then God tells Elijah to go to a new place where he has instructed a widow to feed him and to care for him. So while Elijah has been called to this new place, the widow also has a call on her life. These are two calls, very different situations, but they're all from the same God. They're all from God. So now we meet the widow and discover the situation of her life. She's facing a drought and she has no food. For the widow, this is a life or death situation, and it can be kind of hard for us to understand this in modern times. Today, it's hard for us to understand because even if there's a drought, we can go to the store and we can buy food, and we might pay more for strawberries or something, but there's still food. And for the widow, she was facing this drought. And back then, if you didn't have the crops growing, if there's no water, no crops. No crops meant no food meant you die. It's just kind of plain and simple. I mean, you can't really get much simpler than that, or at least straightforward. And so when we pull back the layers of this story, we begin to see that all hope is not lost in this hopeless situation. Even in the most desperate of circumstances, we see there is a way out of our hopelessness and despair. And in this story, as much as God is making a way for Elijah, he was also making a way for this widow and for her family. So the widow's story is a story of following God when it's uncertain and even in the face of death. Because that's how serious the situation was. She's getting ready to die. And there's a lot we can learn from the story of this courageous widow so that we will have the confidence when things get rough for us and when God calls us, that we can trust him to know that we can go where he's leading, especially when we think we can't do it. So the first thing we're going to look at is the widow's impossible situation. So as we begin this story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath, we can see how devastated she must have been with her current situation. When Elijah finds her, the Bible says she was collecting some sticks so she could build a cooking fire to prepare a last meal for her and her son. She was expecting to die. So I'm going to read it again. This is what 1 Kings says, starting in verse 8. Then the Lord said to Elijah, "Go and live in the village of Zarephath, near the city of Sidon. I have instructed a widow there to feed you." So he went to Zarephath. As he arrived at the gates of the village, he saw a widow gathering sticks. And he asked her, "Would you please bring me a little cup of water?" As she was going to get it, he called to her, "Bring me a bite of bread too." But she said, "I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house, and I have only a handful of flour left in the jar and a little cooking oil in the bottom of the jug. I was just gathering a few sticks to cook this last meal, and then my son and I will die." It's so desperate. What a desperate situation. I can't even imagine. And it's funny because we know more about the widow's life than we actually know about her personally. We don't know the widow's name, don't know how old she is, don't know the name of her son, don't know how old her son is. We don't know how long she's been a widow or the name of her husband. But we know a lot about the circumstances of her life. And we know it wasn't good. And she was facing a bleak future. But in the midst of this bleak future, this unknown future, this future that she was expecting that she would be dead, God had a call on her life. Even before Elijah had arrived in town, God had instructed her to feed Elijah. And God had also called Elijah. He didn't know what he would be walking into. He was just told, "Go to this village, and there you will find this widow, and she's going to feed you." He didn't know who she was. He didn't know her name. They didn't have Facebook back then, so it's not like he could just type in the widow of Zarephath and look it up. He simply knew that God had instructed a widow in Zarephath to feed him, and so he was to go and live there for a time, and that this was, God's provision for him. But we have the benefit of hindsight, and we can see how these two lives will become intertwined. But in the moment, neither Elijah nor the widow knew how this instruction would affect the other. They didn't know who the other person was. Again, the widow didn't know Elijah, and Elijah didn't know the widow. They're just simply called by God to go to a certain place and do a certain thing. For the widow, she's simply called to feed Elijah. And for Elijah, he's simply called to go to a certain place where a widow will feed him. So Elijah went to Zarephath as God had commanded. He walked through the gates into the village, and there he sees a widow gathering a bundle of sticks. And he still doesn't even, I imagine he didn't even know she's a widow, but he still didn't know if this was the right person, right? Because he doesn't know the identity of the widow. And it just seems like a chance encounter. And Elijah likely had no idea about the circumstances of this widow's life other than the fact that her husband had died. So as a test, Elijah simply asks her for a cup of water. She can manage that. She can manage to get him a little cup of water. And in this, we see her charity in the face of her own just dire situation and just this task she's undertaking. She drops what she's doing and she goes to get Elijah a cup of water. But for Elijah, this is the sign that he's found the right widow, the one that has been instructed to feed him. And then he makes the ultimate demand. Bring me a bite of bread too. And normally that wouldn't be something hard for her to do, but today it is, because she doesn't have any bread in the house. And in this moment, we can almost sense the frustration and sadness in the widow. In verse 12, she replies, I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house. And she's caught between a rock and a hard place. She knows God has called her. God has told her, feed this man. But she looks at her own situation, and all she sees is her inability. She is unable to feed this man. She doesn't even have one crumb that she can give to him. Surely in the back of her mind, she's thinking, God has told me to feed this man, but I don't have one morsel of bread. Lord, I know what you've asked me to do, but I just can't do it. You can feel her frustration holding that bundle of sticks, knowing it has to last just long enough to cook this little bit of bread for her last meal, even in the midst of knowing what God has asked her to do, and she just feels she can't do it. Have you ever had this happen to you? You feel that God has called you to do something, but you feel completely unable and ill-equipped to do it? And if you have, you're not alone. I mean, if we read through our Bibles, we could list names of people right up to the apostles who couldn't do it on their own, who were called by God, who could not do it on their own. So this widow is in good company. But what the widow doesn't know is that God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. He qualifies the called. Many times we look to our own inability to do what God has asked rather than God's ability to equip us and empower us and to work through us despite what we are unable to do. So when Elijah asked for this little bit of bread, he was really throwing a curveball at the widow, at least to her thinking. She knew what God had called her to do, but she saw only limitations. And that is okay. Life is full of limitations, but there are no limitations with God, and that's something we need to remember. And that's something the widow's going to find out. A limitation for us is simply an opportunity for God to show his power and his glory. The widow felt those limitations. She could, as Elijah's talking to her, she can picture the little bit of flour and the little bit of oil. She doesn't think she can do it. But eventually she made, and we'll see it, she made a conscious decision to do as God had originally instructed her. So the widow took a huge leap and traded her certainty for uncertainty. And as we know, the widow was collecting those sticks to cook her final meal. In light of her situation, her certainty was death. She knew for certain, I am going to die because I don't have any food. So as we read earlier in verse 12, she told Elijah, I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house. And after hearing of the widow's situation, Elijah makes her situation even more complicated, at least maybe to her. In verse 13, he tells the widow, don't be afraid. Go ahead and do just what you've said, but make a little bread for me first, then use what's left to prepare a meal for yourself and your son. And at first we might look at this and think, man, Elijah has a lot of nerve. Like this widow, she's down to her last little bit of flour and last little bit of oil, and she's gonna go make this bread that's going to be the final meal for her and her son. And then Elijah comes along and says, no, give me some first. And it kind of feels a little nervy, you know? And then you can have what's left. You can have the leftovers. Oh, you get the leftovers. And it feels a little nervy. Like to take food out of the mouth of this widow who's about to die, and her only comfort right now is that she can bake this bread and die. But what we think is really nervy is this is Elijah's faith. Because Elijah has been some places. Just a little while ago, he was drinking water out of a brook and being fed meat and bread that came from birds. You know, he went to King Ahab, and he told King Ahab off and did not die. Okay? And then God told him when the food the brook dried up and the food was gone. And then God said, go to this village, which is outside of Israel, by the way, and this widow is going to feed you. So God's not going to bring Elijah this far just to say, go die with this widow. Right? I mean, again, hindsight, we know that God has more for Elijah, but they didn't know. So he shares this with the widow in verse 14. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There will always be flour and olive oil left in your containers until the time when the Lord sends rain and the crops grow again. So I kind of wish I could see the look on the widow's face when he said that. And she must have been thinking, how would it be possible for the flour and the oil to never run out until God sent rain? And how long will that be? So when I was younger, the church I was in at the time had some young adults go on a short-term missions trip to Malaysia. And when they came back, they told this story this is just a story of God's provision. And they were scooping rice to feed to some Malaysian workers. They were in this village, they're feeding them rice. And they're scooping rice, and they're doing, they're just scooping out rice. And they look in the pot, and it's getting low, okay? The rice is getting low. And so they briefly talk amongst themselves, and they send someone, we're going to run out of rice. So go buy some more rice. But then they stopped, and they prayed over the rice they had. And so someone goes off, after that. Someone goes off to buy some rice. And they're just like, well, got to keep going because the line's long that way. And they keep scooping and scooping and scooping. The guy with the rice never made it back, but the lineup, everyone got fed with the rice they had, and they still had rice left over. And they fed all the workers, and it was a miracle. And just like the widow, these young adults traded their certainty that the rice was going to run out for the uncertainty of trusting God, that maybe God's going to do a miracle here. And he did. And they trusted that God had called them to do this and that he would provide, he would make a way. And there are many times in life when we'll face the certainty of a situation where we feel hopeless and lost. It happens all the time, right? Sometimes we just feel hopeless. And sometimes as believers we feel guilty that why would I feel hopeless and lost? And we feel guilty then that we feel this way. But it's fine to feel that way because we're human beings who have feelings. And it's fine sometimes in the moment to feel that maybe I don't know what to do. And if we did know what to do, maybe we wouldn't need God. That's why it's okay to not know what to do. And it's okay to struggle. It's okay to just have moments. But it's in those moments that we need to consider trading our certainty for uncertainty. Sometimes we just need to trust God. And sometimes that is uncertain because we don't know what God's going to do. In the beginning of John 9, there's a story of a blind man, and this blind man had been blind from birth. And up until that point, he had never seen the face of his parents. He's never seen a sunrise, things we take for granted. He doesn't even know what his food looks like. And so for him, the world is just this dark blackness, this void. And that was his certainty, that the world was just this dark place. The disciples asked Jesus why this man had been born blind. Was it because his parents sinned, or was it because he had sinned? And in John 9, verse 3, Jesus tells them it was not because of his parents' sin or his sin. This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. And as the rest of the story goes, Jesus, he makes some mud, he spits in the dirt, and he makes some mud, and he rubs it on his eyes, and says, go wash it off. Go to this place and wash it off. And the blind man did. And he traded the uncertainty of his blindness for certainty of his blindness for uncertainty. He didn't know what would happen when he went and washed off the mud. He acted just in complete trust that what Jesus said would have results. And he came back with full sight. And when we trust God, when we do what he's called us to do, even when we think we can't, when we trade our certainty of now for the uncertainty of the future, that's when the impossible becomes possible. Not because of something we've done, but because of what God has done. It's all for his glory. And it was true for the widow. This was true for the widow. This was true for those young adults in Malaysia, and it was true for that blind man that Jesus healed. So what happens when the impossible becomes possible? So again, let's go back to the story of the widow. In 1 Kings 17, 15, and 16, it tells us that how the widow responded to Elijah. So she did as Elijah said, and she and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days. There was always enough flour and olive oil left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. So once the widow traded the certain for the uncertain, the impossible became possible. And for such a faith-driven, God-trusting move, we only have these 6 words. So she did as Elijah said. She had no idea what would happen when she started kneading that dough to bake that bread. She might have just questioned herself. Maybe she questioned herself. Maybe she thought she was crazy for listening to Elijah because she did not know him. She's met him like 5 minutes ago, and here she is baking bread for him. That was supposed to be her last meal. So how could she trust him? She didn't know. He could have been some lunatic. Maybe she was just being charitable and doing one final act of kindness. Or maybe she took Elijah at his word that the God of Israel would perform a miracle for her and her son because she was obedient to the call of God on her life. But there's something we have to be careful about, though. These 6 words, so she did as Elijah said, these 6 words don't convey how difficult it would have been for the widow to follow God in the face of the uncertainty, even though we know that God can do the impossible. We have to be careful about it because it would have been very difficult. So there's another person in the Bible that we'll talk about who struggled with the call of God, and his name was Moses. I think we're all familiar with Moses, or hopefully we are. The Exodus guy who led Israel out of Egypt. And in Exodus 3:11, we can read his response to God's calling on his life. Who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? So when God calls us, it's easy to see the impossible as something we can't do. That's what Moses did. I can't do this. And we miss the fact that with God, nothing is impossible. Just like Moses and just like the widow, many times we have to look past what we see as limitations and just be obedient to the call. We don't know about what the widow was thinking. We only know the actions she took. At some point, she chose to ignore the impossibilities and limitations and obey the call of God. She still faced the certainty of death by starvation, even while she's baking that bread. When she's baking that bread, her certainty hadn't changed. She was still facing death. She still faced the impossibility of providing food for her family. And in light of all this, she set aside her inability to provide and trusted on what was impossible for her. And God did a miracle in her life and provided because she followed God's call. She and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days in the middle of a drought when there was no food. Her obedience to the call of God changed not only her situation, but also that of her son and Elijah. Her willingness to step out in faith and follow the call of God blessed her as well as her entire household. What was impossible was made possible because she was willing to face an uncertain future as she trusted God. So how is our calling made possible? Being called by God can be terrifying. In case you didn't know. It can be terrifying, especially when you feel inadequate and unable to do what he's asked you to do. But when God calls us, we can rest assured that he will equip us and make us adequate for the calling. Remember, he doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. God doesn't call us to something and then leave us unprepared to face the wolves. He doesn't call us and say, here, go do that, and then turn his back on us. He stays with us, he provides, he brings us courage, he gives us courage, and he equips us, and he remains there with us through the whole thing. So I'll share my call to ministry. When I first felt the call to ministry, I actually had a dream, and I went to the pastor of my church at the time, and I said to him, I think I'm called to be a theologian because I can't speak in public. And he looked at me and he said some of the scariest words that anyone would ever speak to me up until that point. He said to me, no, you're called to be a pastor. That was scary. Now, we don't believe God makes mistakes, but at that time I felt like this is the first time God's made a mistake. First time. I was terrified. I can speak in public. Anytime I was in high school at this time, and anytime I was supposed to speak in public, like, stand up in front of the class, I had one of those like sicknesses that only lasts for that class, and I would skip. And I was better right after the class. It's a miracle. I was better right after the class ended. I won't go into this story, but I did have a teacher give me some payback on that one, though. So don't do that. But I tried to run from the call of God. And I never found for fulfillment. There we go. But it is true, God doesn't make mistakes. I did find that out. And if God calls you to something, he will equip you and prepare you for it. Because he doesn't make mistakes. I don't know what you're called to today. Maybe you're called to be Billy Graham, the next Billy Graham, and stand up in front of people and see thousands of people saved. Or maybe you're called to bring someone a cup of cold water. I don't know. You know. Maybe you're called to share your faith with a friend or a coworker who you've just never talked to them about this before. Or maybe you're called to invite someone to church who hasn't been to church in a really long time. But you should know this, whatever your calling is, it's not based on your skills or your abilities. Never. And I can tell you why I know this. I know this because God used a widow to feed a guy in the middle of a drought when she had no food. But they lived. And if God can do that, he can do anything. So Paul puts it well for us in 2 Corinthians 1:26-29. He says, remember, dear brothers and sisters, that few of you were wise in the world's eyes or powerful or wealthy when God called you. Instead, God chose things the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they are wise. And he chose things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. God chose things despised by the world, things counted as nothing at all, and used them to bring to nothing what the world considers important. As a result, no one can ever boast in the presence of God. So when God calls you, he's going to equip you and prepare you for what he's called you to do. And when he calls, we need to be obedient. We need to be obedient to his calling, even in the face of uncertainty, or the feeling that we're completely incapable, that we're inadequate, incapable, unwilling, unable, Or even sometimes when we feel unworthy, because that happens too. God calls and we're like, no, I can't do that. I'm not worthy to do that. Well, guess what? God thinks differently. Because if God calls you, you are not unworthy. So whatever God is calling you to, be obedient to the call. When the widow was obedient to God's call, lives were changed. Lives were saved. She traded the certainty of her situation for the uncertainty of trusting God. And when she did this, her impossible situation was made possible. So one final question. Whose life will be changed when you trade the certain for the uncertain? Again, I don't know what God is calling you to today. But he's probably calling you to something. He's calling all of us to something. And it's scary. And it can be terrifying. And it can seem outside of our abilities. But with God, nothing is impossible. All things are possible. So I just want to take a moment, and we're just going to pray. We're going to pray that God's calling would be made possible for us, and that we would be obedient. So let's pray together. So Heavenly Father, God, I just thank you for today that we can, again, God, that we can be here, that we can worship you. And God, I know that you've placed a calling on each and every one of us, that you have called us to something. And sometimes you call us to multiple things. And God, so often it's so easy to slip into the temptation to look to our own abilities and our own skills and think, I can't do that. But God, we know that when you call us, you qualify us. And God, I just pray for everyone here today who, God, you're speaking to them. God, you're showing them something. And God, for those people who are being called to something that feels like it's bigger than them, and they're inadequate and ill-equipped, and maybe they feel unworthy, God, I just pray that you would show them that they're qualified because you've called them. God, I pray that whatever you've called us to, God, that we would just do it. God, that we wouldn't be like Moses, and we'd be like the widow. And we do as you have said. And God, in those moments when we lack courage, God, I just pray you'd give us courage. And God, when we lack wisdom, God, I pray you'd give us wisdom. And God, when we lack ability, that you will give us the ability. And that, God, that everything that we do, that you've called us to do, would be for your glory and your kingdom's sake. That, God, we wouldn't take the credit, that we wouldn't claim the glory, that is for you. So God, just help us to carry out your will for our lives. Help us to do what you've called us to do. Help us to see lives changed because we're obedient to what you've called us to do. And God, and all the glory will belong to you, as it did with the widow. And God, I pray that it would be so now. God, I just pray as we get ready to be dismissed, God, I just pray that you just be with everyone here. God, help us this week to just be obedient to you and to see what you're calling us to. And God, and to step out in faith and to bake bread even when we don't have any flour left. God, I just pray you be with us, and God, just that you bless everyone here. Give everyone safe travels as they leave, and help us just to every day to lean on you and trust in you. In Jesus' name, amen.